The scent of garlic and ginger clung to the warm paper bags in Lena's hands, a comforting aroma that promised an easy end to a long week. 3 days in Singapore for an acquisitions meeting, a blur of air-conditioned galleries and sterile hotel rooms, and now she was home. She had texted Kaido that her flight was delayed, a small, strategic lie to surprise him. She pictured his face, the rare, unguarded softness that only she was ever permitted to see, when she walked in with his favorite black pepper crab. The private elevator opened directly into their penthouse foyer, a space of minimalist design and breathtaking views of the Shinjuku skyline. It was silent, but it was the wrong kind of silence. Not the peaceful quiet of an empty home, but the held-breath stillness of a secret. The first violation was a scent. A cloying wave of cherry blossom perfume, so different from the clean, sandalwood and citrus notes she preferred, the ones that mingled with Kaido's own scent of cedar and smoke on their shared linens. It was a foreign flag planted in her territory. Lena's hand tightened on the takeaway bags, the paper crinkling in protest. She moved forward, her heels sinking into the plush gray rug. The living area was a testament to Kaido's taste. Low-slung Italian furniture, a single, dramatic piece of abstract art on one wall, and floor-to-ceiling windows that drank in the city lights. And on the custom-made sofa, a splash of color that did not belong, a crimson silk kimono, pooled on the floor as if shed in a hurry. Her heart did not race. It did something far worse. It went perfectly still, a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She followed the trail of discarded clothing, a man's tie, her husband's tie, lying like a dead snake on the marble floor. The door to their bedroom was slightly ajar. Through the gap, she saw a sliver of the scene. A woman's pale back, the intricate lines of a phoenix tattoo just visible over the curve of her hip. Black hair, long and silken, spread across Kaido's pillows. And then, his voice, a low murmur that was usually reserved for her alone. A sound that was both intimately familiar and grotesquely alien in this context. Lena did not gasp. She did not scream or cry. A profound and terrible clarity settled over her. She was the wife of Kaido Tanaka, a man who controlled 3 districts of Tokyo's underworld with the quiet precision of a surgeon. She knew the currency of his world: loyalty, power, and consequence. Betrayal was not a matter for tears, it was a matter of action. She looked down at the food in her hands, the meal she had carried across a continent as a simple offering of love. It suddenly felt obscene. Slowly, deliberately, she backed away from the bedroom door. She walked to the center of the living room, to the exact spot where the city lights hit the polished floor. She held the bags out and simply let them go. The containers burst on impact, scattering crab legs, rice, and glistening sauce across the pristine marble. The sound was a dull, wet thud in the charged silence. It was a desecration. An answer. Without a backward glance at the life she had built within those walls, Lena walked back to the elevator, her steps measured and calm. She pressed the button. As the door slid shut, sealing her out of her own home, she met her own reflection in the polished steel. Her face was a mask of perfect, cold composure. The woman who had entered this apartment 30 seconds ago was gone. The woman leaving was someone new. Someone who knew how to disappear. Her first stop was not an airport or a train station. It was an anonymous convenience store in a different ward, one where the press of bodies offered a shield. Inside, under the hum of fluorescent lights, she bought a cheap prepaid phone and a bottle of water. In the store's cramped restroom, she methodically stripped her old life away. Her SIM card was snapped in two, the pieces flushed down the toilet. Her credit cards, her driver's license, her residency card, all sealed in a small plastic bag and dropped into the sanitary disposal bin. She kept only the cash from her wallet, a substantial amount she always carried for emergencies. This, she thought with a flicker of bitter irony, certainly qualified. She removed her wedding ring, a flawless, square-cut diamond that felt like a brand on her skin. She stared at it for a long moment. It wasn't just a symbol of a broken vow, it was a leash. Kaido had resources that bordered on limitless. He could track any electronic signal, flag any use of her name or identification in seconds. The ring itself, with its custom design and registered serial number, could be traced through any pawn shop in the country. She couldn't sell it. She couldn't keep it. She wrapped it in a tissue and pushed it deep into the bottom of a public trash can on a busy street corner, a king's treasure discarded amongst refuse. Her mind, usually a whirl of art historical data and auction logistics, was now a cold, calculating machine. For 3 years, she had lived adjacent to Kaito's world. She had attended his sterile business dinners, smiled politely at men with missing fingers and dead eyes, and learned to read the subtle shifts in atmosphere that signaled danger. She had never participated, but she had always paid attention. She knew how his organization operated. They looked for patterns. They anticipated. To vanish from a man like Kaito, you couldn't just run. You had to erase the person you were. She bought a ticket for a night bus, paying cash, using a common, forgettable name. Not south to Osaka or west to Hiroshima. That was predictable. She chose a route north, to a region known more for its harsh winters and rural quiet than its bustling cities. As the bus pulled out of the Shinjuku terminal, the lights of her former life receding behind her, she finally allowed herself to feel. It wasn't the sharp sting of betrayal she expected. It was a vast, hollow ache. The man she had married, the one who had shown her a side of himself he swore was hers alone, the quiet intensity, the surprising tenderness, the fierce, possessive protection, had been a lie. Or, worse, he was real, but he was not exclusively hers. The intimacy she had cherished was just a room he visited, and tonight, she had found it occupied. The lie wasn't that he was a monster. The lie was that she was his only salvation. The bus rumbled on into the darkness, carrying a ghost away from a life that was already turning to ash. Kaito found the carnage in the living room an hour later. The smell of pepper crab hit him first, acrid and wrong in the otherwise sterile air. He saw the spilled food, a violent splash of chaos against the controlled order of his home. Akemi, wrapped in one of his silk robes, followed him out of the bedroom, her expression confused. He didn't even look at her. His eyes were fixed on the stain. It wasn't random. It was a statement. Deliberate. Precise. It was Lena's language. "What is this?" Akemi asked, her voice a fragile thing in the heavy silence. Kaito's gaze swept the room. He saw his tie on the floor. He saw the single, faint indentation on the rug near the bedroom door where she must have stood. He could almost feel the ghost of her presence, the weight of her silent judgment. He had made a mistake. A colossal, unforgivable error in calculation. He had treated her like a civilian, a beautiful, intelligent woman who lived in a world separate from his. He had forgotten that she saw everything, that her quiet observance was its own form of power. "Get dressed," he said to Akemi, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "My driver will take you home." "Kaito, what's wrong?" He turned to look at her then, and for the first time, he truly saw her. She was a distraction. A political convenience from a rival family meant to test his discipline, a test he had just spectacularly failed. She was nothing, a ghost already fading. "The arrangement is over," he said. The words were absolute. There was no room for argument. She left without another word, sensing the shift in the air, the gathering storm in his stillness. Alone, Kaito walked to the window and looked out over the city he owned. The glittering lights felt like a mockery. He had built an empire on a foundation of control, on the principle that every variable could be managed, every outcome predicted. He had allowed a moment of weakness, of stupid, arrogant indulgence, to threaten the one thing in his life that was not part of the empire. The one thing that was simply his. Lena. He had dishonored her, and in doing so, he had dishonored himself. A cold fury, directed entirely inward, began to burn in his gut. This was not the anger of a man whose property had fled. It was the shame of a man who had broken his own code. He pulled out his phone and dialed his second-in-command. "Ryosuke," he said, his voice a blade of ice. "Find my wife. Use every resource. I want to know where she is before the sun rises. And I want it done quietly." No one outside this family is to know she is gone. He disconnected the call and stood in the silent, ruined room. The search was not a request. It was a reclamation. He would find her. He would bring her back. Forgiveness was irrelevant. Order had to be restored. Weeks bled into a month. The search yielded nothing. It was as if Lena had dissolved into thin air. Rio's suitcase reports were a litany of failures. No credit card usage. No activity on her passport. No contact with her few friends in Tokyo or her family back in America. Her digital footprint had vanished. Her physical presence was a ghost. They swept through train stations, hotels, and airports, but the trail was cold from the first hour. It was a masterful disappearance, one that spoke of a chilling foresight Kaito had never fully appreciated. She had not panicked. She had executed a plan. He became a wraith in his own life, moving through meetings and negotiations with his customary cold efficiency, but an essential part of him was absent. His men felt it. The air around him was colder, the silences more dangerous. The penthouse, once a sanctuary, was now a monument to his failure. The stain on the marble had been scrubbed away, but he still saw it, a ghost of her final, damning judgment. He found himself wandering through her spaces, her side of the closet, still faintly smelling of her perfume, her small office, where art books were stacked in neat, precise piles. He picked one up, a heavy volume on the Japanese ceramic art of kintsugi, the practice of repairing broken pottery with lacquer dusted with powdered gold. The philosophy behind it was that the piece was more beautiful for having been broken. He had not just broken them, he had shattered them. One night, unable to sleep, he found himself staring at the book again. He remembered a conversation they'd had months ago. She had been tracing the golden seams on a photograph of a repaired bowl. "It doesn't hide the damage," she had said, her voice soft. "It honors the history of the object. It says that the breaking is part of its story now." At the time, he had seen it as a quaint, artistic sentiment. Now it felt like a prophecy. He flipped through the pages, his fingers brushing over the glossy images. Tucked inside the back cover was a thin, paper brochure. It was for a small, obscure museum in Kyoto, specializing in restoration arts. It was nothing. A piece of junk mail. But it was the only thing in her meticulously organized office that was out of place. It was a whisper in a silent room. Kyoto. He had been looking for a fugitive. He should have been looking for an artist in hiding. Lena had found a fragile piece in the quiet, moss-covered corners of Kyoto. She had rented a small, traditional apartment with paper screens and a view of a tiny, manicured garden. She found a job working as a registrar for a private art collector, a quiet, elderly man who cared more for the history of his pieces than their monetary value. Her Japanese was fluent, her knowledge of art impeccable, and her fabricated resume, built around a fictional widow seeking a new start, was flawless. She called herself Hannah, a name as common and beautiful as a flower. It was a quiet life, a simple life, and every night she was haunted by the ghost of the life she had lost. She missed him. It was a venomous, unwelcome truth. She missed the weight of his arm around her in the dark, the low rumble of his voice when he spoke her name, the feeling of absolute safety she'd felt in the presence of the most dangerous man she had ever known. She had loved Kaito Tanaka not in spite of what he was, but because of it. She had been drawn to his power, to the absolute certainty with which he moved through the world. He was a force of nature, and she had believed, foolishly, that she was his calm center. The betrayal hadn't just broken her heart, it had broken her perception of reality. The foundation of her world had been a lie. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, the bell above the gallery door chimed. Lena was in the back, carefully cataloging a new acquisition, a delicate Edo period scroll. She didn't look up, assuming it was a courier. "I'll be with you in a moment," she called out, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet space. There was no reply, only the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps on the polished wooden floor. A sound she recognized in her very bones. The air grew heavy, thick with a sudden, suffocating tension. The faint scent of cedarwood and cold rain reached her. Her blood turned to ice. She slowly raised her head, her gaze traveling from the immaculate, hand-stitched leather shoes, up the length of a perfectly tailored black suit, to a face that was carved from stone. Kaido stood in the middle of the gallery, his hands in his pockets, watching her. He was not angry. He was not relieved. He was simply inevitable. He looked like a predator who had finally cornered his prey after a long, patient hunt. The silence stretched between them, a chasm filled with a month of pain and fury. That is when she made the mistake of looking up, and in his dark, unreadable eyes, she saw not the triumph of a hunter, but the hollow emptiness of a king who had lost his kingdom. Lena, he said. Her name, the one she had shed, was a physical blow. It was not a question. It was a statement of ownership. The confrontation, when it came, was not in the gallery. He waited. He simply stood there, an immovable object, until her employer had left for the day, and she had locked the front door. He followed her in the rain, his footsteps a silent echo of her own, a few paces behind. He didn't speak, didn't try to touch her. He just shadowed her through the winding, lantern-lit streets of Gion until she reached the wooden gate of her small apartment building. She knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he would not force his way in. He would wait outside, all night if he had to. He was a master of siege warfare. She slid the door open and stepped inside, leaving it open for him. It was not an invitation. It was an acceptance of the inevitable. He entered, his large frame seeming to shrink the small, delicate space. He took off his shoes at the entrance, a gesture of respect so at odds with the violation of his presence that it was almost laughable. He stood in the center of her tatami mat room, rain dripping from his expensive coat onto the floor. "How did you find me?" she asked, her voice steady. She would not give him the satisfaction of her fear. "A brochure for a kintsugi exhibit," he answered, his voice low. "It was the only thing out of place. The only mistake you made." Of course. The one small piece of sentiment she had allowed herself, a memory of a conversation, a hope for beauty in broken things. "It wasn't a mistake," she said, her voice turning sharp. "It was a message. Did you read it?" A flicker of something, regret, perhaps, crossed his features. "I understand the symbolism. Do you?" She finally turned to face him fully, her arms crossed over her chest. The anger she had been suppressing for weeks rose like bile in her throat. "There is no gold lacquer that can fix this, Kaido. You didn't just crack the bowl. You ground it into dust. You brought a stranger into our bed, into our home. You took the one place I felt safe, and you desecrated it." He didn't flinch from her words. He absorbed them like blows. "It was not an affair of the heart," he stated, as if that clinical distinction mattered. "It was a political misstep. Akemi was a pawn from the Ishikawa clan, sent to test my discipline." Lena let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "Your discipline? You talk about it like you spilled wine on a rug, not like you betrayed your wife. Do not insult my intelligence by framing your infidelity as a business error. You made a choice. You chose to disrespect me, to humiliate me, and to break the vow you made. It was a failure," he conceded, his voice dropping even lower. "A failure of my honor. A failure I will not repeat." This was his confession. Not an apology, but an admission of a flaw in his own internal code. It was the most honest thing he could probably offer. "You're right," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You won't repeat it. Because there is nothing left to fail. We are finished." The finality in her voice seemed to finally break through his control. He took a step toward her, his hand reaching out, then stopping short of touching her. "That is not an outcome I am willing to accept," he said. The words were a quiet threat, a reminder of who he was. "It's not your decision to make any more," she countered, standing her ground. Before the conversation could escalate, a sudden, sharp noise from outside shattered the tension. The sound of splintering wood, a shout, and then the unmistakable, sickening crack of a silenced gunshot. Kaido's head snapped toward the door, his entire posture changing in an instant. The husband was gone. The Yakuza boss was back. He moved with a speed that was terrifying. In one fluid motion, he was across the room, his body shielding hers, pushing her down behind a low table as the paper screen of her front window exploded inward. A dark figure was framed in the doorway, a gun raised. Kaito didn't hesitate. A weapon appeared in his hand as if from thin air, and he fired twice. The reports were dull coughs in the small room. The intruder crumpled to the ground. "They followed me," Kaito breathed, the words a curse against her ear. His breath was hot, his body a wall of solid muscle against her back. "The Ishikawa clan. They think you are my weakness." Forced proximity born from violence. It was the language of their world, the one she had tried so desperately to escape. Outside, more footsteps pounded in the narrow alley. They were not alone. "The back," she whispered, her mind racing. Her professional competence took over, assessing the layout, the exits. "There's a fire escape over the garden wall." He grabbed her hand, his grip like iron, and pulled her toward the rear of the apartment. Another gunshot ripped through the wall, inches from her head. She didn't scream. Adrenaline sang through her veins, a familiar song from a life she thought she'd left behind. Kaito kicked open the back door, leading them into the small, rain-slicked garden. 2 more men were climbing over the wall. He dealt with them with brutal, lethal efficiency. It was a terrible, mesmerizing dance of violence she had only ever glimpsed before. As he dispatched the second man, a third appeared from the side alley, taking aim directly at Kaito's exposed back. There was no time to shout a warning. Lena acted on pure instinct. She grabbed a heavy ceramic planter from the edge of the porch and hurled it with all her strength. It struck the gunman's arm, sending his shot wide. The bullet ricocheted off the stone wall with a deafening crack. That split second was all Kaito needed. He spun, his movements a blur, and the third man fell. He turned back to her, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing with a dark, terrifying fire. Blood was trickling from a graze on his temple, but he didn't seem to notice. He looked at her, then at the shattered planter, and a new understanding dawned in his expression. She hadn't just been a victim he needed to protect. She had saved him. She had chosen a side. In that moment, she crossed a line she could never uncross. She had actively participated in his war. The quiet life of Hannah, the art registrar, was over, killed in a hail of gunfire in a rain-soaked Kyoto garden. She was Lena Tanaka again, whether she wanted to be or not. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the truth of what they were, a dangerous man and the one woman who was just as dangerous to him. The journey back to Tokyo was a blur of controlled speed and suffocating silence. Kaito's men materialized out of the Kyoto night, cleaning up the violence with quiet, grim efficiency. Lena was bundled into a black, armored sedan, Kaito a solid, unmoving presence beside her. The intimacy of the small space was unbearable. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the metallic tang of blood mixed with his cologne. She stared out the window, watching the city lights streak by, feeling the invisible walls of her cage rebuilding around her. She had run, she had hidden, and in the end, all it had taken was one night of violence to drag her right back to the center of his world. They did not speak until they were back in the penthouse. The space was exactly as she had left it, minus the spilled food and the ghost of his mistress. It was sterile, silent, and suffocating. She walked to the window, wrapping her arms around herself, looking out at the familiar skyline that now felt like a prison. "The Ishikawa clan will not stop," Kaito said from behind her. "They made a move on you. They broke the code. They declared war." "This is your war," she said, her voice hollow. "I was just collateral damage." "No," he said, and his voice was closer now. "You were the target. They believe that by removing you, they can unbalance me. They are mistaken. They have not unbalanced me. They have focused me." She turned to face him, a bitter laugh escaping her. "And what does that mean? I'm supposed to be grateful? You brought this storm to my door, Kaito. The one you found in Kyoto, and the one you created right here in this apartment." He finally showed something other than cold control. A deep, profound weariness settled into his features. "I know," he said. I broke our world, Lena. And in doing so, I exposed you to my enemies. It is the greatest shame I will ever carry. He stepped closer, his gaze intense. But that woman in Kyoto, the one who threw a planter to save my life, she is not just a civilian. She is a queen. My queen. And I will burn this city to the ground before I let anyone touch her again. His acknowledgement of what she was to him was no longer deniable, no longer hidden behind the quiet gestures of their old life. It was a raw, possessive declaration, forged in blood and betrayal. She had wanted to escape his world, but the truth was, a part of her was made for it. The same sharp, analytical mind that could spot a forged painting could also anticipate an enemy's move. The same calm under pressure that allowed her to negotiate million-dollar art deals had allowed her to act decisively in a firefight. "What do you want from me, Kaido?" she asked, the question hanging in the air between them. "I want you to help me destroy them," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You see things I do not. You understand nuance. They think they are fighting a brute. I want them to face a king and his queen." A cost had been paid. Her quiet, ordinary world was gone forever. To go back to it would be to live a lie, always looking over her shoulder. The only path forward was through the fire. She looked at this man, this lethal, flawed, powerful man who had shattered her heart and then put himself between her and a bullet. She had seen him at his worst, and she had seen him at his most brutally efficient. The choice was not about forgiveness. Forgiveness was a luxury they couldn't afford. It was about survival. It was about power. She could be a victim of his world, or she could be a ruler in it. The final confrontation was not a battle of guns, but of information. Lena, now installed back in the penthouse, became the strategist in the shadows. While Kaido marshaled his forces, she dove into the Ishikawa clan's public-facing businesses, their art collections, their charitable foundations. She used her professional skills, her trained eye for authenticity and provenance, to find the cracks. She discovered that their entire financial empire was propped up by a series of masterfully forged artworks, used as collateral for massive loans. It was a secret hidden in plain sight, a vulnerability no one in Kaido's world would ever have thought to look for. She found the linchpin, the single piece whose exposure would cause the entire house of cards to collapse. She presented her findings to Kaido in his office, spreading documents and photographs across his polished desk. He listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he looked at her, and the respect in his eyes was more potent than any declaration of love. He had seen her as a beautiful object to be protected, then as a fugitive to be reclaimed. Now he saw her as an equal, a weapon he had never known he possessed. He acted on her intelligence with surgical precision. There was no bloody street war, just a series of quiet, devastating phone calls. An anonymous tip to an auction house here, a quiet word with a banking regulator there. Within 48 hours, the Ishikawa clan was financially ruined, their honor stripped, their power broken from the inside out. Their leader was found having taken the only way out his code allowed. The threat was neutralized, not with a bang, but with a whisper. Lena's whisper. In the aftermath, a new kind of silence settled in the penthouse. It was not the strained silence of betrayal or the tense silence of war. It was the quiet of a landscape after a storm. The danger had passed, but the world was irrevocably changed. One evening, she stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, the city lights a familiar tapestry below. Kaido came to stand behind her, his presence a warm weight in the room. He didn't touch her, but she could feel his gaze on her reflection in the glass. "My honor is not in my name or my territory," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel through the floor. "It is with you." It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact, a realignment of his entire world around a new center of gravity. She had thought his betrayal meant she was disposable. She had learned, through fire and blood, that she was essential. She closed her eyes, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. The woman who had fled to Kyoto was gone. The woman who had cried over a broken marriage was gone. In their place was someone harder, colder, and infinitely more powerful. She had paid for that power with her peace, with her innocence. She did not turn around. She did not offer him words of forgiveness or absolution. Instead, she lifted her hand, reaching back without looking. He understood. His hand met hers, his strong, warm fingers lacing through her own. It was not a gesture of romantic surrender. It was a pact, an acceptance of the new, dangerous truth of their lives. She had chosen to stay, not as his wife in the way she had been before, but as his partner in the empire of shadows they now ruled together. The view from the top was breathtaking, and it had cost her everything.